Muy buenas noches, bienvenidos nuevamente a la serie internacional de Tiempo de Mercadeo. Estamos en Cambridge, en los Estados Unidos, para hablar con Steve Spear de MIT sobre lo que son la innovación y la competencia en el mercadeo moderno. Ya regresamos. Good evening and welcome to my program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
A pleasure and an honor to have you here. I have had a question since I first read your book, one of your books, because when I read the title, the original title, it didn't mean what it was translated into in Spanish.
Right.
It was translated, How to Kill the Competition.
Right.
But that isn't what you mean, right?
Not
what
exactly.
You meant. You didn't mean that.
No.
What did you mean then?
Yeah, so the original title for the book was, it's come out in two versions. One was
Yes.
called Chasing the Rabbit, the second one, The High Velocity Edge. In both cases, the point of the book and what the title was trying to imply was that in most markets, the key to success is not coming up with one good idea, hoping that no one else will ever have another good idea, but rather that it's the succession of good ideas and the ability to generate them at a very high speed that allows certain organizations to simply outrun their competition. Now, I think the translation into Spanish, as we were mentioning before, is sometimes when things go from English, which is sometimes occasionally understated, to things which go into Spanish slightly more dramatically and elaborately stated. I think the editor decided to go with a more elaborate, dramatic translation than perhaps I intended. But the key point is the idea that competition is not about having one good idea and being in a position of strength where everyone else is in a position of weakness. It's about a velocity in terms of understanding faster, better, more consistently what needs the market needs satisfied, understanding better, faster, more consistently how to deliver on those needs, and better, faster, more consistently recognizing gaps between what you're doing and what might be better to do, and then closing those gaps quicker than anybody else.
How could you define competition then? Is there a definition for competition? Because I remember some people define competition from several viewpoints. How is your definition of competition?
Yeah, so my book starts with an example. I live in Boston, and every year we have the chance to watch the Boston Marathon come past our house. And when you watch, particularly the leaders go by, visually they all look the same. They're all about the same weight, have the same build, same musculature. They're all running, wearing more or less the same uniform and equipment and sneakers and that sort of thing. What typically is the case, though, is that coming right past our house, and we live about mile 23 out of the 26.2 miles of the race, you'll have this cluster of runners who are competing very, very fiercely with each other. But typically they're competing for second, third, or fourth place. That those who are competing for first or second are, at that point in the race, many, many yards in front of everybody else. And when you watch the difference between those who are going to win or get second place and those who are going to get third place or no prize at all, you see that the ones who are winning are running with just a little bit more fluidity, a little bit more smoothness, a little bit more grace. And so the competition in the Boston Marathon is about how people who are at the extreme of physiological preparation, how they get that last little bit of advantage, not by preparing more, but taking whatever potential they have and exerting it with greater fluidity. And when you translate that back to organizations, what you see with organizations is that they compete more or less in the same markets as their counterparts.
Yes.
They compete offering products which are more or less similar to their counterparts. They depend on the same technology and science as their counterparts. But the ones that win and win consistently are those that can take all those resources and everything that's the same and yet put everything together with more fluidity, more grace, more coordination to deliver more value into the market more quickly with less exertion.
I remember I once read that there is an invisible competition, which is the competition that you face in the internet because you don't physically see it. You don't know where they are. Like, if we go to talk about finished goods, Walmart is a competitor that you may have in front of you, but Amazon you don't have in front of you.
Right.
So what do you think about that invisible competition?
So as far as this invisible competition, at the end of the day, whether it's Walmart with a quote-unquote bricks and mortar facility or Amazon with this virtual facility, at the end of the day, there's someone buying something. And not only are they buying a physical product, but they're buying the set of services which surround the product. It could be information, it could be instruction, it could be comparison shopping around features, availability, price, whatever else it happens to be. The key to competing then is to understand not who's across the street or who's across the street from you online, but really what is the motivating problem for the end buyer, and what are you doing to configure yourself to solve that problem for the buyer. And if you can start with that question, what problem am I solving, that gives you much better insight into how you need to configure your own operations in order to compete against your rivals, whether they're across the street or somewhere online.
One more thing about competitors and competition is that some people are saying that you compete again in a segment, you compete against 3 or 4 at the most. No matter if they are 100 competitors or 100 products, you compete against 3 or 4. Is that right?
The number of rivals you have in a particular sector certainly depends on the sector. And I can imagine that if you're competing for physical goods, which are largely commodity, easy to ship, easy to compare both in price and features and functionality, then the number of potential competitors can be very large. When you're competing with products which are more distinctive, have other attributes which make them very difficult to move over distance and in particular time, then the number of competitors can shrink. Now, as far as, and that certainly starts getting to services where the service has to be rendered personally, then of course you really compress the number of competitors you have, because again, this issue of moving the value across distance and time becomes more difficult. But what you're saying in terms of this, the number of competitors you face, hinges of course on how easily can value be moved across distance and time. And that gets back to this discussion we were just having around defining the work you do by the problem you're solving for somebody else. So one of the advantages you have of being close to other people is that you can understand with greater nuance, greater subtlety, greater clarity, the particulars of the problems they're experiencing. And because of that informational advantage, you can come up with better approaches to solving on those problems than someone who's removed by hundreds, if not thousands of miles, and consequently removed from meeting those problems by hours and days. And if you can have that sensitivity, then you give yourself a real advantage by compressing the number of competitors you face. On the other hand, if you can't develop that sensitivity, then you really open up, sometimes by extraordinary amounts, the numbers of competitors who are going to challenge you for your business.
Steve, we're going to take a break and go to a commercial break, okay?
Oh, sure, of course.
Vamos entonces a una tanda de comerciales y ya estamos de nuevo con ustedes. Ya regresamos. Steve, one more thing you like to talk about is innovation. What's innovation? Is that an improvement? Because so many people, like Ted Levitt used to say, you remember that, so many marketers confuse innovation with, getting better. What's the difference between those two words, and what may be said that innovation is?
Yeah, so there are a couple of terms which I think get confused and confounded. So you have improvement, you have innovation, you have discovery, things like that. And I think the mistake people often make is to think that improvement is something which is small, routine, easy, and then innovation, on the other hand, is something that is big, rare, due to serendipity, a sudden inspiration. I think that characterization and that differentiation between improvement on the one hand is something as simple, routine, repeatable, that kind of thing, and innovation, which is something which occurs only occasionally and only to those who are blessed by genius or insight or some combination of genius and insight, I think it's actually a fairly false splitting between the two.
Let me ask you one question. Cars that are coming with GPS included, I mean, from the factory. Is that an innovation? Is that an improvement? What is that?
Yeah, so GPS is a fine example. And from the perspective of the customer, it's an improvement, right? Because the GPS is an improvement over paper maps and printed directions and that sort of thing. It gives you the information you need to get from one point to the other, but it's more convenient. It provides you feedback that you're on track versus off track. I mean, we've all had the experience of trying to follow a paper map or printed instructions and then realizing that we thought we were following the directions, but we haven't, and now we're lost, whereas GPS can correct on that. So from the perspective of a user, GPS is an improvement, and a big improvement over the previous condition of paper directions and maps. That said, somewhere along the line, GPS was a major innovation technologically.
As a GPS itself.
As a GPS itself, that's exactly right. GPS depends on very sophisticated electronics. Paper maps have no electronics. It depends on very sophisticated communication. Paper maps require no communication. It requires satellites and positioning technology. So GPS is a tremendous innovation. So again, whether something's an innovation or an improvement sometimes depends on the perspective of the person looking at that object. So for you and I, when we get into a car, the GPS, oh, that's much better, we'll say to ourselves. But for the person who created the GPS, it required so much change over so many dimensions and parameters that they can very fairly claim it to be an innovation.
High definition television is an improvement, not an innovation.
So again, sometimes the user doesn't fully appreciate all the discovery and all the learning that has to occur in order for them to experience an improvement in the product or the service they're benefiting from. Now, the thing about improvement and innovation is that from the perspective of a manager, they have something very much in common, that both require learning. And if you think about, it's one of these things which is very simple when you say it out loud, that the whole reason there's something to improve is that there was something that wasn't understood well enough that it still had problems. And so, the whole improvement, the whole idea of improvement is to fix what's broken. And if something is broken, it's not because we intended to be broken, it's not because we want it to be broken, it's broken, it needs improvement because initially we didn't understand, we didn't know how to make it not broken. So improvement requires learning, and certainly innovation also requires learning. And I think that's where people make the mistake, thinking that somehow innovation is something which just occurs through inspiration to the genius. And what they fail to do is see the hard work required of innovation. Now, there's some good news in that, and we can talk about it further, is that the fact that innovation is a process, innovation is a set of skills, implies that innovation is something that can be learned. And in an era when the work we do is more complex, the systems in which we're embedded are more complex, the markets in which we compete are more complex.
Right.
The need to innovate is increasingly important. And for those organizations which recognize innovation as a skill which can be taught and developed and harnessed, they give themselves a tremendous advantage over those who are waiting for the strike of lightning from the gods to give them a good idea.
I remember William Duggan, a professor from Columbia University, he talks about continuous and discontinuous innovation. Mm-hmm. Is there, is there continuous and is there discontinuous innovation?
So this issue of continuous and discontinuous innovation, I think the answer there is it depends. So thinking back to the automobile, that when the automobile was first thought of as a concept, that was discontinuous because it was the automobile in contrast to instead of horse-drawn carriages.
Right.
And in fact, when you look at some of the first automobiles, the physical metaphor was of a horse-drawn carriage. The seats looked like carriage seats. The passenger compartment looked like the passenger compartment on a horse-drawn carriage. And the motor was often placed where the horse would go. So it looked much like a horse, but instead of a horse, you had a motor.
That might be a reason for them to talk about horsepower.
right, and that's why they talked about horsepower, because our carriage has more horsepower than your horse. And so over time, though, initially at least, there was this attempt to understand what the basic architecture of a car was. Where would the engine go? What type of engine would it be? Would it be electric? Would it be steam powered? Would finally internal combustion? But there was this consolidation of ideas to a dominant architecture. That the power would come off an internal combustion engine. Most of the time would be in the front of the car, sometimes in the back of the car. That weight would be supported first on a frame, but then to this unibody construction. That steering would be done with a steering wheel and not with a tiller or a rudder like in a boat, not with reins like on a horse, though they tried that too. And there was this emergence of a dominant architecture. So then when you had the emergence of a dominant architecture, different functions performed by different parts of the car, a lot of improvement at that point appeared again to the user as continuous. How to get more explosive power when gas mixed with oxygen in a cylinder, how to get greater efficiency when gears match, that sort of thing. But even within the automobile, there's been innovation which represents a very sharp break from tradition, from the dominant architecture. And the introduction of electronics, for example, was a very sharp break because it required the introduction of a whole new set of engineering skills into the design of a car. And not only the introduction of a new set of skills, but the integration of one set of skills with the other. So we see this, these sharp changes in innovation, these continuous changes in innovation. But again, it always comes back to the innovation is prompted by someone trying to solve a problem. And the core skill, and so what we see then throughout all these examples is that a core skill of any organization is the ability to see problems quickly, solve them quickly and efficiently, and then take what's been discovered and learned and incorporate it so that greater value is brought out into the marketplace, and greater value brought into the marketplace faster than what rivals are able to do.
I asked about cars because I know that you did a lot of things for Toyota, and that we'll talk about that after we come back from commercial, because we're going to go to another commercial break.
Okay, yeah.
Vamos entonces a otra tanda de comerciales y ya estamos de nuevo con ustedes. Steve, let me ask you more about innovation, because that's a very difficult, that's a very confusing topic for most people. And what can we say about services? In a bank, for example, how can a bank innovate?
Yeah, so the key to innovating in services, products, whatever else it happens to be, is again starting with the problem statement. And then when the problem statement is identified, generating very quickly alternatives to what's currently being done. And again, it comes back to the basic notion. The reason we have a problem is not because we want to have a problem, but because we're doing things in such a way that we didn't fully understand how to avoid the problem. So once we recognize we have a problem, then what we need to do and what we have to do and want to do is start generating very, very high-speed learning about the nature of the problem, and then very high-speed experimentation through a series of potential solutions so we can quickly converge, and again, converge more quickly than our rivals on an answer that solves for the problem we've seen and addressed.
We're getting into the high-velocity age. We're getting into the high-velocity age content. What does that mean, high-velocity age?
When I started my research, what motivated the look was the realization, and not my own realization, but a tremendous amount of research done ahead of me.
Was Toyota what took you or made you get into that?
Well, Toyota was certainly one of the compelling examples. And Toyota was an example of a common phenomenon. And what that common phenomenon was that in the same field, so companies in the same industry creating more or less the same products and services into the same market space, that the gaps between those who are great and the rest, and not best and worst, that's not the issue, best and average, the differences were extraordinary. And the differences in quality, for example, and this goes back to research done in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the differences in quality on manufactured products could be a difference of 100 times or 1,000 times in defect rates. The differences in productivity in manufacturing could be 2 times, 3 times, 4 times between the best and the rest. When people started looking at design organizations, these differences in productivity also between the number of engineering hours required to develop a design at the best were sometimes 1/2, 1/3, 1/4 what was typical in an industry. So these gaps were extraordinary. Now, where the velocity part comes in is when you start looking at the gaps, what you realize is that the leaders weren't necessarily always the leaders. Sometimes the leaders were average, sometimes the leaders were worse than average, and that was, we can elaborate, but that was certainly the case of Toyota, which was an awful car company in the late 1950s. But what is commonly characteristic of the leaders is that they got much better, much faster, with much greater endurance than anybody else in their industry. So even if they started equal or behind, because they were, in a sense, able to outrun the competition, they operated at a higher velocity of improvement, they were able to get ahead, and because they continue to operate at a much higher rate of improvement and innovation, they're able to not only stay ahead but widen the gap. Now, Toyota was certainly an example of that, but we see this in services. So, for example, I do a good amount of work in healthcare, and what we see is certain healthcare.
That was going to be the next question. Healthcare.
So, just a little bit on that. We see certain healthcare providers who they're average, and in being average, they have a certain capacity given the number of doctors and nurses they employ. They do a certain amount of harm to their patients in the form of mismedication, infections, wrong side surgery, and other complications. And then you have other organizations which do exactly the same type of healthcare work, and they have no defects, no complications. Their capacity is much better. Their staff feels far less overburdened. Their patients feel much better served. So as different as healthcare is from autos, as it is from microchip manufacturing, as it is from defense contracting, what we see in healthcare, like all these other fields, are these extraordinary gaps between the very best and the average.
Steve, don't you think that quality is very much a matter of perception? Don't you think it is more perception than reality?
So as far as quality goes, there are two issues. One is the functionality a product or service provides, and there the quality is very clearly defined by the user. I mean, you can load all sorts of features onto a product, and this often happens in organizations which are engineering driven. The user may look at those and say, well, this isn't a quality product because I don't value those things. So that's...
You know what? Let's leave it for next week because we're running out of time today.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll pick it up, yes.
Okay, we'll pick it up. Entonces dejamos aquí hasta la próxima semana cuando Steve nos va a responder o va a continuar con la respuesta sobre la perceptología de la calidad. Por el momento entonces no nos resta sino agradecerles que nos hayan acompañado en la noche de hoy y desearles una feliz noche. Muchas gracias.